Alrighty, so now that we've got some technical skills done and dusted, now it is time for a little bit more theory about light. Photography is all about the documentation of light after all, and the best photographers are the ones who can not only see the light for what's available, but also can understand the quality of it and how to get the most use out of it as well. In today's lesson, we are going to do a little bit of a light study, and I'm going to show you examples of different kinds of light and different qualities of light. And today's assignment will also be to go out and replicate this light for yourself. It'll be fun. Now, when we're thinking about light, one of the main things to think about is directionality. Where is the light coming from? What direction is that light coming from? And usually we can determine that by two things. Brightness, of course, especially on our subject, the brighter portions suggest the direction the light is coming from, but we can also determine that by shadow. Light always casts a shadow, and we can determine its direction by the way the shadows are cast. The other thing to look out for is what is the quality of light. Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it angled? Is it diffuse? Is it flat? Is it harsh? Is it colored? There are so many different adjectives to describe what kind of light it might be, and different qualities of light have different creative uses and effects. And understanding all of these effects will enable you to be more expressive with your images down the line. In some of these examples, we'll talk about the style of light in both a environmental and a studio way so that you can better understand how the same descriptions can apply to different contexts. And we'll start with hard light because it's probably the easiest to understand and see for yourself. Hard light goes hand in hand with soft light, so we'll cover that next. The easiest way to understand hard light is that it is high contrast. Really bright highlights, really dark shadows. Hard light has a very strong look of dimensionality, and in a high contrast situation, regardless of whether it's out in the world or in the studio, most of the time, the brighter portion is usually the subject that you're going to be focusing on or the main focus area of that image. Hard light is used for accentuating drama, creating an edge, or making something just a little bit more serious. It's both literally and metaphorically putting a spotlight onto your subject. And hard light out in the world looks like this. It's where shadows that are cast are usually quite hard and defined, like the lines of the shadow from the street. Now, how this works is that the light that's being thrown here is really intense or really bright or hard. Because of that, the shadows are more defined when it comes to their lines. And this occurs because there's more directed light intensity in that area, reducing the amount of diffusion. The more intense the light, the more intense the shadows. And usually you find this kind of light out in the world during sunny days, anytime between 2 to 3 hours before midday or 2 to 3 hours after midday. And the easiest way to start spotting hard light in the real world is to look for hard edges. And that's especially easy in a city where tall buildings shield light from certain directions, casting their shadows through the streets. In a portrait scenario, hard light is most certainly a look. It's not typically associated with a flattering look, that's for sure, as the harshness of the light can actually bring out or accentuate parts of the face in unflattering ways depending on the angle that the light is coming from. You can tell that a light is hard because the subject will look blown out in certain portions of the face, and there will be really bright hotspots that will appear. Usually in a portrait setting, hard light is achieved through a very focused beam of light. And this means that the light source is usually either quite small and powerful, or it's concentrated by specific light modifiers like barn doors, grids, or snoots as well. Now, soft light is the opposite of hard light. It's definitely less contrasty than hard light, and soft light is usually associated with a gentler, broader, and more even look than hard light. And out in the world, you'll typically find soft light during and just before the sun rises, or just before and after the sun sets. However, depending on the subject that you shoot, there may be just enough ambient light around in order to light your subject with a really soft light kind of look. And essentially, soft light is still directional, but it is characterized by the fact that the edges of the shadows are soft and terminate with a very smooth gradient. And soft light in general is very flattering, especially in portrait scenarios or even in landscapes as well. The reduced amount of contrast is perfect for creating just enough dimension without it being too overbearing, like in the case of hard light. Because sometimes too much drama is just not something that you want. Now, in the studio, soft light is achieved through the use of a softbox or some kind of diffusion technique or tool where there's a large, even light source, such as a scrim, a reflector, or even a window. And this image you're looking at of me right now is an example of soft light being used in a studio setting. In this scenario, my face is very softly lit. There's no harsh points. And while there is some directionality, causing some shadows on my face on this side, it is just enough that it creates dimension and accentuates the shape of my face by casting shadows from the nose, the jaw, and the other ridge lines of my face. And this is a natural look that most people try to achieve, and you can do so with one singular light. Now, onto lighting techniques. Front lit lighting, or flat lighting, or butterfly lighting as it's also called, is, you guessed it, light that comes from directly in front of the subject. It goes hand in hand with backlit lighting, which we will cover next. Now, front lit lighting isn't that commonly used because, especially on faces, it exposes everything and creates no shadows. And sometimes this might be what you want, especially on subjects who have like immaculate faces with no blemishes or wrinkles. But on most people, front lighting is actually not very flattering because shadows create character and flat lighting provides no shadows whatsoever. That being said, for things like product photography or macro photography, or if you want to really get creative, reflected light in a street scene, sometimes it's actually desirable as it is something that really accentuates the subject and illuminates them well. We'll come back to front lighting when we deep dive into portraiture towards the end of the course. The opposite of front lighting is backlighting, and it is one of my favorite lighting methods to play with, and it occurs all the time in both the real world and in studio lit settings as well. Essentially, it appears anytime the main light source occurs behind the subject in your composition. What then happens is that your subject will fall dark, and there will be kind of a reverse contrast, so to speak, between the background and the subject, where instead of your subject being lit like normal, it's the background that's lit properly. And this creates what's called a silhouette, in that your subject will no longer be lit or detailed, and instead they'll just be a shadow. And this can create a lot of mood and a lot of drama in the image due to the amount of contrast. And depending on the scene, this can be a good or a bad thing, depending on how you use it creatively. Now, typically, lit areas and bright areas in a composition will draw the most amount of visual attention to the eyes. However, in some situations, it's the absence of light and the idea of reverse contrast that can also draw our attention too. And this is what is called a visual pattern, a collection or a arrangement of elements that have implied meaning in the context of visual language, and we'll cover more on this later on in the course. In a portrait setting, be careful of backlit subjects, however, as cool as it might look, backlighting inherently means that your subject is not lit correctly, which may or may not be what you're trying to achieve. If you find yourself in a backlit situation and you instead try to expose for the subject being lit correctly by upping your exposure, you may find that your highlights will be very, very bright and even blown out in some cases. And in some scenarios, that might be what you're going for, or it might not be, and you have to instead find an additional way to then front light your subject in addition to the backlight. Studio light is what we're doing right now with this very here scene. Studio light is the opposite of natural light and refers to a scenario where we're able to control each and every single light source manually so that we can change our lighting to suit our needs. Every single light in this scene is specifically placed for example. And in a studio, you'll either have continuous lighting like in this setup, or you'll have a strobe lighting setup, which will, flash or suddenly appear. The main light in a studio setup is called the key light. And this is usually the brightest light, and it is the light source that does most of the heavy lifting in your scene. Additionally, we can have what's called a fill light off to the side that brightens up any shadows cast from the key light. And usually we have just a little bit of fill, not too much, as shadows on the face are still desirable in most cases. From there, sometimes some setups will have what's called a kicker or a hair light or a separation light, which is a narrow light cast onto the subject but behind them, and usually from behind the head, and that helps the head stand out from the background just a little bit more. And then in the background, you have the background lights, and sometimes these lights are used to fill in the shadows cast by your subjects if they have any, but other times they're also used to illuminate things in the background, especially if you have things in the background to keep things interesting. And sometimes you have like accent lights in the background as well, which can further aid in your background interest, like I have here in this scene. Natural light is the opposite of studio light, and it occurs, you guessed it, naturally. So some people swear by only shooting in natural light, and most certainly there is a skill to achieving the right kind of look in the right kind of natural light. But natural light can be quite tricky to work with sometimes, because sometimes the weather just doesn't like to play nice. And, it's worth training your eye to determine the quality of light at different times of day in different areas, like, in the sun or in the shade and under different weather conditions and patterns like sunny conditions or cloudy weather, or even on an overcast day or when it rains. Not only that, but the sun actually goes through different phases of the day, which actually ends up being very useful for us as photographers so that we can more accurately determine which phases we would like to photograph in. Something that I see quite a lot of beginners complaining about is that sometimes they can't replicate shots. And that's because different lights at different times of day have different looks, and you can't edit your way out of that different lighting scenario. You always have to shoot the same shot in the same light to get the same look. So for example, shooting an image at midday will look distinctly different to shooting an image while it's raining. And it's not like you can somehow magically Photoshop in the sun or something like that. Images shot in the midday sun will have a different level of saturation, color cast, exposure and everything else, compared to, the same image being shot at sunrise or at sunset. They're all different. That all being said, you can achieve somewhat similar results when comparing sunrise images to sunset images and vice versa, aside from the very obvious detail that the sun will be facing completely different ways when you are shooting either of those times. From a color and quality of light perspective, though, they can look very similar in most places around the world most of the time. Most often, people find the general sunrise and sunset times to be the most optimal times to take photographs in across most photography genres. And this is because the light is the most gentle and even, and it has the most color, and the shadows are also the longest as well. And this is due to the position of the sun during these times. It's very close to the horizon, meaning that in general, there is less light being thrown around on the earth. And less ambient light generally means that most things have a darker luminosity, is what it's called, meaning that all of the colors literally become darker, which in turn make them a little bit more saturated as opposed to being blasted with light during the day and during the midday sun. And it's the same effect, right? The sun being less harsh gives us softer light at this time. In general, if you're looking to take nicer photographs, you need nicer light. And the best light is usually around those times for most situations, which is why most photographers who use natural light shoot at those times. All right, today's assignment is going to be a multi-day assignment. It is a light study. What I want you to do is set up a composition somewhere that you can repeat every single day for the next 10 days, or however long you want to do it for, but I would recommend at least 10 days. Now, the idea is to come back to the same spot using the same settings and taking the same composition in the same way, but every single time you do, come back at a different time. Come back during sunrise, come back during sunset, come back during midday, 11 p.m., 2 p.m., nighttime. Come back at a different time each day for 10 days, but take the same shot for 10 days. The idea here is to study the light and to see how it behaves at different times of day. When you have exactly the same composition shot in exactly the same way, the only variable is the lighting conditions. Now, doing this light study in this way allows you to then isolate the variable, which is the differing time of day and thus the differing light. And it will give you a tremendous amount of perspective on just how different the light is at all of these different times of day. Very straightforward one today, so hopefully you enjoy that one. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.